Hey everyone, I'm Ramirez. I'm the chef and founder of Todo Verde, and today we're going to be cooking some tamales with mole and some carnitas mushrooms that are just in time for the holiday season or really any time of the year. But we are going to get started. First things first, if you are planning to cook along, be sure to soak your corn husks. I soaked mine overnight, but you can soak them in hot water to expedite the process. And you just want to soak enough corn husks to make about a dozen tamales for this recipe, or of course more if you're scaling up. And you want to soak them in warm water, put something over them to kind of weigh them down. I put a heavy bowl over them, and you just want to make sure that they're nice and soft and pliable and ready to be filled with our masa. So that's the first thing you should work on. And the next thing we're going to work on is we're going to make our mole. We are going to roast our mushrooms and get all the fillings ready before we start working on our masa. So in order to make the mole, it's actually a really quick 30-minute mole. It could even be a little faster depending on your skill level. But this is just kind of my little shortcut to make a really delicious, full-bodied, flavored mole sauce. So essentially what I have is I have 3 guajillo chiles, which are kind of longer, narrow chiles that I use for a little bit of mild heat. And then I have 3 pasilla chiles. Let me make sure I'm looking at this correctly. 3 pasilla chiles and 4 guajillo chiles. And these are going to be what flavor the mole to give it that nice kind of earthy chile flavor, not overpowering, not spicy. These are kind of, I would say, more of like almost like a slightly spicy raisin flavor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add my chiles to the pot I have here on my back burner, just a small pot. And I'm going to add 3 cups of vegetable broth to that pot. And if you have more time, you can obviously, cook them in a little bit of oil or dry toast them to even unlock more of that flavor. But because we're trying to work a little bit quickly, because there's so many layers to make the mole, the mushrooms, and of course the tamales, we're going to just get right into it and cook those down. And you just want them to cook maybe for about 10 minutes or so on medium heat, maybe even less, until they're nice and soft and tender. And then you can see that the chiles have kind of created a little tint in the color of the broth. It'll be a little bit of this like reddish hue within the broth, and the flavor will be totally permeated in that. So I used a vegetable broth that I just rehydrated or reconstituted in some water. I like to use better than bouillon. So it's sort of a paste that I reconstitute, and this is going to make it even more flavorful. So I'll let that work. Let me put the lid on. I want that to come to a simmer. I might drop it to about a medium low once it comes to a simmer and just let that work slowly. And then here on my front burner, I'm going to turn that on to about a medium heat. And I'm going to add, today I have some sunflower seed oil. I typically cook with grapeseed oil. You can use avocado oil, whatever vegetable oil you have on hand. And you want to add about 2 to 3 tablespoons to the bottom of a skillet that's preheating to about medium heat. And we're going to start cooking 1 medium onion that I diced up. It's just a rough chop, really. It's going to all get blended up for the mole, but this is just going to expedite the process. Typically, when I'm making more of a low and slow, lengthier process for the mole, I usually either half my onions or quarter them, and I cook them either over an open flame or on a comal until they get nice and charred and blackened. In this case, we'll get a little bit of the blackening that'll happen with just cooking them in oil, but it'll go a lot faster in terms of cooking time just because it's already been chopped up. So I want to look at my oil, and when I see that it gets kind of translucent, that it's moving pretty quickly, and you also see when it moves that it has sort of like a ripply texture on it, that's when you know your oil is hot. And of course, if you don't know, there's 2 things you can test. You can grab a piece of onion or whatever you're cooking and drop it in, and if you hear that sizzle, it's hot. Or you can just put a touch of water on your fingers and throw it into the oil, and if you hear that sizzle like I just did, I know my oil's hot. So I'm going to drop my onions into the skillet. Let me grab a spatula. Make sure I get all the bits of onion. And I want this to just start cooking until I see it get a little bit soft, translucent. Hopefully I start to see a little bit of browning happening, so it'll sear slightly. All of that is just to add a depth of flavor to the mole. So I don't want to just add the raw onion blended and, you know, simmer it with them in already in the mole sauce. I want to have it really create a layer here that I can't replicate. As that's going to take a few minutes before I add my garlic into it. I'll just go over the other ingredients that I'm going to be putting into this mole. And then if we have some time, I might even get right into the mushrooms. So that was 1 medium yellow onion. And then I have here 4 cloves of garlic that I just, as you can see, just roughly chopped or minced up. That again is also going to help expedite the process. I don't want to throw that in now because it'll likely burn before the onion has finished cooking. So I'm going to wait a few minutes before until I see, and I'll show you what that looks like when the onions hit sort of a point where I feel like they'll just take another minute or so with the garlic and be completely done. I have sort of a hot mess in here, but it's so good. And this is really another heart of our mole. So typically mole will call for almonds, peanuts, sesame seeds. This is our shortcut here. And I already have a dry roasted peanut butter. This is 6 tablespoons of peanut butter. You can also use an almond butter, cashew butter, depending on your nut preference. I also have done it with sunflower seed butter. I really like peanut butter here in this because obviously peanuts have such a strong, intense flavor, and it just creates a really nice balance in the mole. And then I have 3 tablespoons of tahini, which is essentially a paste made out of sunflower seeds. So this is a shortcut that we're taking here. And then in terms of our spices, I have here some raw turbinado sugar. You could also use piloncillo. I have 2 tablespoons of the raw turbinado sugar here. I have 2 tablespoons of my cacao powder, or if you have cocoa powder. The difference here is cacao is raw, cocoa is toasted. So cocoa might be slightly stronger in terms of a flavor profile, and it will also be a little bit darker. And then I have 1 tablespoon of dried Mexican oregano. This is just oregano from my garden that I've dried myself, but whatever oregano you have, typically the one that you can find in stores is Italian, still gonna work just fine. That's 1 tablespoon. Then I have a little over a quarter teaspoon, so a quarter teaspoon plus 1/8 of a teaspoon of ground cumin. And that's right in here. So just a little ground cumin. This is gonna give it a nice earthy depth of flavor. Then I have a quarter teaspoon of cinnamon, really important here. The cinnamon I use is Ceylon cinnamon, not to be confused with cassia cinnamon, which is the type of cinnamon flavor profile that you typically taste in a apple pie, for example. Ceylon cinnamon, you're gonna find more in Mexican cuisine and Vietnamese cuisine. It has some people call it Mexican cinnamon, although its origins don't lie in Mexico, but it has definitely like this flavor that reminds you of Mexico and all these like really, really delicious flavors. Like think of té de canela, this is it. And then we have, actually that's it for these spices. We're gonna add salt and pepper to taste. The last thing I wanna mention here is that I have, which are starting to melt because I have my oven that's on. I have a quarter cup of just chocolate chunks or chocolate chips. This is just going to add a layer of chocolate. Not all mole has chocolate. I think that is a myth that we need to debunk. People just assume all mole has chocolate. It does not. But this one that I'm making today does. So I have a quarter cup of just some plant-based chocolate chips that I'm going to be adding to just kind of give it a nice chocolatey, creamy flavor consistency. And one thing that I forgot to grab out of my fridge is actually 1 tortilla. And I'm going to just char this tortilla over an open flame. And that's gonna give us another depth of flavor within our mole. So if we look at our onions here, I can see that I'm starting to get some browning. And I got to keep an eye on it so that it doesn't burn, but this is exactly what I'm looking for. So I could already smell that the onions are super aromatic. And one thing I didn't do here, which I like to do, is just flavor with a little bit of salt. So I want to add a nice generous pinch of salt and flavor as I go. Or season as I go, I should say. Let me check on my back burner here. I can see that I have a boil going on with my chiles, and I could already see that they're nice and soft and tender. I'm going to drop that heat and just let that keep simmering for a few minutes. And I want those to be nice and soft because we're going to blend them. So those will be nice, soft, tender, and blend really smoothly into our mole. So let me grab that tortilla. I happen to have a random brand that I typically don't have on hand, but I can't let them go to waste. But typically what I have on hand here at home is a brand called Kernel of Truth. They're an LA-based tortilleria, and they focus on organic, non-GMO, US grown corn. So really all the values that I'm looking for in a tortilla maker, and also the flavor is just unparalleled. So I'm using another brand that I got. I think somebody might have brought a pack of tortillas over and just brought like a random brand I had never used. They're fine. But definitely you want to try to choose organic non-GMO corn. The flavor is just, the flavor of the corn is just unmatched with other brands that I've used. If you make tortillas at home, you can also use Hacienda, Bob's Red Mill, Gold Mine, so many other that are now really focusing on really good quality corn. So let me check my onions again, and you can see that I have this really nice color from the searing in the oil. There we go. And at this point, oh, I have an onion overboard. Let me scoop that over so I don't step on it. At this point that I see that the onion is nice and translucent, and I'll bring that up so you can see a little closer. I have this nice browning. It hasn't burnt. I'm keeping an eye on it. It's just a touch under medium heat. At this point, I'll go ahead and add my garlic and let that also start to become a little bit fragrant and get a little bit of that color that I am looking for. There we are. And I'll mix that in. And I'll just cook this for maybe about another couple minutes. So I do want the garlic to get a little, I'm not going to get crispy because I'm not going to leave it in here that long, but I just want to see a little color on it, aside from it just becoming soft and translucent and tender. At this point with our back burner, this looks really soft and tender to me. I'm going to just turn my chiles with a pair of tongs just to make sure that this, some of the bits that are not fully submerged in my broth are getting rehydrated. And at this point, it doesn't even need to be on for it to keep rehydrating. So I'm actually going to move that aside so that I can char my tortilla on that back burner. So I'll turn up the heat slightly here, and I'll put my tortilla down directly on the flame. You can also put your tortilla down on a comal, or you can also pop it in the oven. We're going to be using the oven for mushrooms. So you can also use a tostada if you already have tostadas on hand. I like to use a tortilla that I've charred because the flavor of a fried tostada is different than a tortilla that's been cooked over an open flame. And so that's the flavor that I'm looking for, is that open flame, slightly charred and kind of smoky tortilla, not so much a tostada, but a tostada still does the trick in keeping a nice texture within our mole. Let me use my tongs to flip over that tortilla. Okay. We are almost done here with the elements of our mole. So if you've made mole in the past, the more traditional route, you could already see that this feels like a lot of shortcuts. But I'm curious to see what you think in terms of the flavor. I think that it is really close enough, and it's never going to be just like a mole that you've spent hours on because you haven't spent hours on it. But it's still going to be really, really good. Yes. So I'm looking for that smokiness. Hopefully my smoke alarm doesn't go off, which has happened in these classes before. And I'll just cook that tortilla just for another maybe 30 seconds on that side, and then I'll take it off. I'm gonna turn off my heat here on the front burner at this point. And this is what I'm looking for. A nice browned onion with some slightly browned garlic. Ooh, and my tortilla is full on burning. It's literally burning. Let me turn that off. There we go. And this is what I'm looking for my tortilla. You could go a little longer if you want. I'm gonna leave mine as is, and you should hear that it's kind of crunchy, and obviously it's got the charring. That's gonna add some thickness to the mole, and it's also gonna add a little bit of flavor. So at this point, we can start to add all those elements into a blender and blend them up. I'm gonna let them cool for just a few minutes while we get our mushrooms into the oven, just so I don't have a super hot mixture in my blender, and then I'll blend it all up. So I'll give that everything's turned off at this point. I'm just giving it a second, and I'm going to add my mushrooms to the oven. So I have a few varieties of mushrooms here, and I'll pan down so you can see it. I don't have a ton of counter space, so I'll try to make this work. So I have about 24 ounces of mushrooms. It may seem like a lot. I'm making about a dozen tamales, but these mushrooms are going to cook down significantly, and it's going to probably even feel like we don't have enough. And for the shiitakes, I just got whole shiitakes. You can clean them off with a little damp towel or paper towel if you see any debris on them. I cut a little bit of the stem off that had a little bit of debris on it and was also a little bit too tough. And then you just want to slice them up into little thin strips that are going to cook down a lot nicer in the oven, and also will fit nicely into our tamal filling. So I have about 8 ounces of our shiitake mushrooms that are here on one sheet pan. This is a little quarter sheet. And then in my half sheet, I have a few other varieties. And these are all oyster mushroom varieties. I just picked these up at my local health food store. They came in a chef's pack already together. And what I like to do is just shred these versus chopping. You could absolutely chop these. Sometimes, honestly, the chopping kind of helps versus shredding if you come into a point where like you're not really super paying attention to cook times, and your mushrooms might have a little bit of a bite to them. When they're chopped, it's a lot better than when they're long strips like this, just because it's harder to bite into this and break it apart with your teeth. And if it's chopped up, then all you have to do is take that bite. So you can do this, or you can hand shred. So it's more of like this shredded chicken feeling. And then once you get that all broken down, that'll go back onto the sheet. So I've preheated my oven to 350 degrees. And I'm going to just toss these mushrooms in oil and some of our todo verde carnita seasoning. And the reason I'm using our carnita seasoning is because I really love how subtle the flavor is. It's really versatile, can go with a lot of different dishes. And it has mushroom powder in it already too, so it has this really nice depth of flavor. And it's not as strong of a flavor as our tinga or al pastor, which have obviously chipotle, achiote, and so many other flavors. So here's our trio of seasoning. It's our carnitas, tinga, and al pastor. And today I'm going to be focusing on using our carnitas. This I use in a lot of sauces, broths, obviously making carnitas as well. The tinga I really love for making frijoles de la olla, a lot of variety of dishes as well. This one has definitely this tomato, chipotle, onion, garlic flavor profile. And then, of course, we all love al pastor, and that's more of this achiote, guajillo, pineapple, slightly sweet flavor profile. If this is your jam, you can use any of these for this recipe, but because I don't want to outshine the mole, and the mole is already so complex and flavorful, I'm going to go with our carnitas, which again, I feel is the most versatile. So I'm going to spread my mushrooms around on this sheet, and I'm just going to use my hands to just toss them all in some oil. And I'm going to eyeball the oil, but it should be more or less maybe about 3/4 of a cup, half a cup to 3/4 of a cup. So, which might be actually all the oil I have in here. So I'm just going to drizzle oil all over the mushrooms. And for this larger sheet, I'll add about 2 tablespoons of our carnita seasoning. I'm going to give it a good shake just to make sure everything is well, I can't talk while I'm shaking, well distributed in there. So I'll grab my measuring spoon, sprinkle on about 2 tablespoons of the seasoning, and the smaller sheet will get about 1. So this is about 16 ounces of oyster mushrooms, and the other one's 8 ounces, so it's exactly half. I'll use my hands here to just toss everything together. And of course, you can add more of the seasoning if you want to, just to give it even more of a pack of flavor. And the seasoning does have salt already in it, so you can always adjust. Salt is not the main ingredient here. It obviously has so much more. So this particular blend has, because it's carnitas, it has a little bit of like orange, tangerine oil, like lime peel, mushroom powder, nutritional yeast, black garlic. I think this one also has apple cider vinegar powder. I'd have to look at the label. I'm just kind of going off the top of my head. But just a lot of elements that add a depth of flavor. If you've ever made our carnitas recipe that's in my cookbook, this is like the next level up, just because, you know, I really try to focus on the cookbook, having the ingredients be like super accessible, because we were using jackfruit there. You know, I didn't want to have people feel like, oh, I have to go out and find this jackfruit thing I've never used. Plus she has all these, like, you know, 15 ingredients in the recipe as well. People would never make that. So instead, I just wanted to make it overly simplified, and make sure that we just focused on you know, the jackfruit being like maybe potentially the only barrier. So I'm going to add here oil to my shiitake mushrooms, and I'm going to add a tablespoon. So that was about a 1/4 cup of oil. And then I'll add a tablespoon of my seasoning. Literally my seasoning. How awesome does that sound? Hopefully my parents are proud. All right. And hopefully you're proud at home using this or seeing it on the grocery store shelf, because all we ever see is quote unquote mild and spicy taco seasoning. Yesterday when I went to go get these mushrooms at the health food store, I always go and I'm nosy on the walking down the aisle of the seasoning aisle, or in this case it's the international aisle where I saw it, other seasonings, and it's like fiesta tacos, spicy tacos, what other tacos did I see that were like, what is this, like, who is making this stuff? But the only one that I saw that was like an actual taco flavor was chorizo. But yeah, like, I mean, when you go to Mexico, you see tacos that are actually tacos, not like, oh, señor, me da 2 tacos de spicy. You don't do that. You eat tacos al pastor, tacos de carnitas. So yeah, that's really, really odd to me. So all right, my mushrooms are all seasoned up. Let me try to pan back up to myself. So I'm gonna add them to this preheated oven that I have preheated at 350. Honestly, I feel like I could have added a touch more oil. I might add like a touch more olive oil over the top. The mushrooms, they add they have a lot of liquid content in them, even though they seem like a sponge that absorbs liquid. So they've already absorbed all the oil that I poured over them. But I just want to add just a touch more because I really want to make sure I get a nice sear on these. And then I'll add them to my oven and I'll cook them for about 20 minutes or so. So I'm just pouring over and you can pan down and see. Just added a little bit of olive oil. So let me do it here so you can see here. Just a touch more because I feel like it got so dry with the seasoning and the mushrooms absorbing all the oil. Okay, so that will go into my hot oven for about 20 minutes. Maybe even longer, depending on how crispy you want your mushrooms to be. Obviously, they're going to lose that crisp once they steam inside of the tamales. Let me add my timer here. Let's start with 20 and then we'll go from there. And then let's start blending up our mole so we can start cooking that down. So let me get this out of the way. All right. So our items are a little cooled down, enough for me to feel a little safer blending everything up. I have my Vitamix blender cup. Highly recommend a high power blender to blend everything up until nice and smooth. If you don't have one, you might have to blend in batches, and you also might need to pass your mole through a strainer to just get it to just be a little bit more smooth through. You might find pieces of chile or things that didn't blend up quite well if you don't. So you can see here, my chiles are nice and soft and rehydrated. They've also expanded. So that is exactly what I was looking for. I'm gonna start with just the chiles before I add the broth, because then everything is going to just splash around as I drop it in. So I'll hold off on the broth and let me pan down here so you can see. I'm gonna add my onion and my garlic directly into the blender. You can see that's still nice and hot and steamy. Smells so good. I don't eat a lot of onion and garlic. And you might have noticed like, oh, she didn't chop the onion and garlic on screen, because I've done that in a class before and I totally started crying, and it was just a little bit too much of a hot mess where it's kind of unpredictable. So I'll just do that beforehand and make sure I'm good to go before starting. But I don't cook with a ton of onion and garlic. I don't really consume it raw in recipes like ceviche, for example. But for this mole recipe and a few others, when it's cooked down in the ways that we did, it really does make a difference in adding another layer of flavor that I think is important. So now we have our nice crispy, you can hear it, crispy tortilla that I'm just gonna break up slightly and add in. And I have, let me get the little pieces that fell. I have our seasoning. So our sugar, cacao, oregano, cinnamon, cumin is all going in. Make sure all of it gets in there. I'll get my spatula. We have our chocolate chips going in. Grabbing my spatula because the ones on the bottom did melt with the oven being on. So that went in. And last thing going in here, aside from the broth, is our mixture of tahini and peanut butter. So let me just scrape off the spoon. Let me just lick off the spoon off camera. Little snack time. Wow, and I had a little bit of chocolate on there. So good. I love tahini. All right, putting that all into the blender. So good. I always recommend getting a natural peanut butter. So a peanut butter that doesn't have any additional ingredients. Like literally all you should see on the label, and this is me being kind of like a purist when it comes to certain ingredients. Peanut butter should just have literally peanuts, salt. That's it. Peanuts have a lot of oil. You don't need to buy one that has palm oil or all these other ingredients. And then your masarina, your tortillas should just be corn and lime, and that's it. Nothing else. Okay. So let me get rid of all this. Keep my spatula. And we are going to pour in our broth from the rehydrated chiles. If you find that your mole is a little bit too loose, or maybe it's not loose enough, you can always adjust it. This is like, mole is a beautiful thing that just kind of ebbs and flows, and you go with it. It needs more liquid, add more broth, add more water to it. If it feels too liquidy, cook it down or char another tortilla and blend it into it. So you can definitely ebb and flow and move with however the mole needs to be. So let's go ahead and blend this. And I might blend here for a couple minutes because it needs to blend until really smooth. Okay, so what I was looking out for was just trying to get all the little pedacitos de chile that I was seeing on the side of the blender broken down. If you don't have a tamper, you might have to stop blending, use a spatula to scrape down the sides of the blender, help your blender along, and then start it again. So this is this nice kind of smooth consistency that we're looking for that definitely holds a line on the back of a spoon or your tamper. This is not salted yet, but still so good. That's so good. All it needs is literally salt, and it's so good. So I'm gonna pour this back into that small pot that I used to rehydrate the chiles. And this is going to just cook to just marry the flavors at least 10 minutes, but honestly, you can keep it going a little longer. You definitely want to put a lid on the pot because most moles, I mean all moles, because of the thickness of it, a simmer is really like a bubbly hot mess all over your stove. So unless you have a really, really deep pot with a little bit of mole on the bottom, you want to put the lid on to catch all that splatter that's going to happen. So I'm going to go back to the stove and pour this into that pot and turn it on to just low heat. And you can see how beautiful this mole is. Nice and smooth, creamy. It smells amazing. And you saw all the shortcuts we took, and it still is a really, really great mole. I think that, during the holiday season, everybody wants, like we want to bring out all those special dishes that so many of us love. But then, for those of us who are in the kitchen, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. If somebody's like, oh, puedes hacer tamales de mole, it's like, oh, okay. Con everything else going on, and then somebody else, oh, can you make that atole you like to make? Oh, can you make the this and that you love to make? Can you make that poblano pasta we love it when you make? And it just adds on. So sometimes you need a little bit of support in the kitchen that's gonna still be really delicious, and that people will not notice that you spent maybe half the time, maybe even less, making this thing, and we're still using all natural ingredients. It didn't come out of a box or anything like that. We're just using ingredients that have already been slightly processed for us, maybe dry roasted for us already, so that we're not having to individually dry roast. And if you've never made mole, the reason that folks individually dry roast, I know some people take that shortcut where they dry roast everything together. I don't prefer that, just because things have different cook times. Dry roasting almonds is going to be a little different than dry roasting some sesame seeds. The size is so different, the density is so different. So it just calls for individual you know, ingredients getting different cook times, different love, really. Love is not the right word. They all get the same love, just different time that you're caring for them while they're cooking. So I'm going to add about a tablespoon of salt here. Everything in there was unsalted. So I'm going to add a tablespoon of salt. Let that come up to, and actually I have to turn on the stove first. I'm going to put it on just low heat, like sort of medium low, and let that cook. It's already warm because all the ingredients were mostly warm, and the blender also warms everything up. And I'll taste for salt and grab my spoon. So good. I'll leave it there for salt and let it come to a simmer and marry a little bit more. And then I'll taste it again. This is one thing that kind of evolves as it cooks. So you can keep tasting and see if you need to adjust. So I'll put my lid on, which is hot because the oven's on. I keep saying that and I keep putting stuff there and it gets hot. Okay, good thing I have Señora Abuelita hands that don't burn easily. Let me not jinx myself. So that's just like on medium low, and we'll just let that do its thing. You'll start to see it'll start to bubble and splatter, and we'll let that cook and just become even more delicious. While we're waiting for our mushrooms, which still have about 8 minutes left, we're gonna get into our masa. So I'm gonna grab everything we need, and also I'm gonna put my tamalera here. So you can already start to see my process of getting ready for tamales. So you need a big pot that has some sort of a separation or a strainer, or something that's just going to create a separation between the boiling water on the bottom and the tamales themselves. And so I have that ready to go. It already has water in it. And then I need to actually warm up some water, 2 cups of water. And I'll talk about this right now. All right. So for our masa, I'm actually using a recipe from my cookbook, La Vida Verde. It's a separate recipe, but I'm using it for the masa. So you can do the same if you're, you know, making any other kind of tamales, but you want to make the masa vegan. You can use the recipe here. It's on page 73. And this is for the tamales negros. So I'm not going to be making tamales negros, not adding activated charcoal, but I'm just going for the masa. I added, and I even made like a slight variation to this, but just to make it even more simplified. So I have here 3 cups of dried masa harina. And in this case, I'm just using Bob's Red Mill, just an easy to find masa harina. You can find organic. They sell it at Northgate now, like pretty much a lot of grocery stores, whether they're Mexican grocery stores or just other grocery stores. This is organic masa harina. It's already gone through the process of nixtamalization, which if you're not familiar with that process, essentially it's corn that has been cooked with calcium limestone and then soaked for several hours. Typically it's cooked at night and then soaked overnight in that same solution that it was cooked in. And then the next morning you would get up and you would clean the maize, clean the corn, and you're removing essentially like the outer skin or the outer layer of the corn, which helps make the corn more digestible. It unlocks more nutrients, and because that outer layer is gone and it's been soaked in the scald, our body just absorb that nutrient so much more. So I have 3 cups of this that Bob from Bob's Red Mill already nixtamalized, then dried again and ground into a masa harina. So all you literally have to do is add hot liquid to it and it will reconstitute and become a masa. Whenever you're measuring your cups, if you go into the bag and you kind of cram a measuring cup in there and you try to squish it all in and it's very compacted, you're going to end up with really dry masa because you're actually adding more than the recipe calls for. So you wanna try to pour the masarina into your measuring receptacle, or you wanna just gently scoop up and maybe grab the rest, and just it should be a really light, airy, fluffy measurement. And that is typically why people who compact their flours or their dry ingredients will yield dry cakes, dry whatever, cookies, dry tortillas, all of that stuff. So be mindful of that. So I have my 3 cups of masarina. I have 2 cups of hot water that I'm gonna add to it right now just to get it reconstituted. And then in addition to that, I'm gonna add 1 cup of, really important here, refined coconut oil that I've just melted down. I just added the glass jar to a little bit of that small pot that I'm using for the mole. I just added a little bit of water, melted it down, measured out 1 cup. I dropped a little bit of masarina in there by accident, if you see that. Really important about the refined is that if you use virgin coconut oil, it's gonna taste like coconut, and then you're gonna add it here, and your tamales are gonna taste like coconut, and then you're gonna be like, "She said use coconut oil, it's the worst." Please, refined, keyword here, use refined coconut oil, so important. So this is gonna be what replaces our some people use shortening, some people use lard, some people use, other vegetable oils, but this is a saturated fat. If I put this coconut oil in the refrigerator, it will solidify, similar to a lard. It will solidify in the refrigerator. So that's going to give it a really nice kind of body for the masa that I'm looking for. You could also add vegan butter if you wanted to. I'm just going to stick to the 1 cup of refined coconut oil for this recipe. The recipe in the book calls for an additional 4 tablespoons of vegan butter, which is also made up mostly of coconut oil and cashews and stuff like that. I'm going to omit that extra oil today and just go with the 1 cup. I have 2 teaspoons of baking powder. This is what's gonna make our tamales slightly fluffy and expand and just kind of puff up slightly. I have 1 cup of vegetable broth. Again, I used just a paste that I reconstituted with some hot water. I actually added extra tablespoons so that the hot water that I'm adding is going to be flavored with, this extra amount of vegetable broth flavoring that I added here. I added enough for 3 cups. So this is 1 cup vegetable broth, or 1 cup liquid here. And then I have 2 cups of hot water that I'm gonna add. So in total, it's 3 cups of liquid plus your oil. I'm probably confusing you now, sorry about that, but you can look at the recipe down below too. And then last thing we'll add, aside from the vegetable broth, is just salt to taste. So let me grab that hot water and then we'll get going with our masa. And I better hurry because we have 2 minutes before the mushrooms are done. I don't really have to get it done in 2 minutes, but you're gonna hear a beep right now. Okay, so I need my 2 cups of hot liquid here. And let me grab another spatula because I'm gonna need to work this. 3 cups masarina, 2 cups hot water. Let me make a little well here. I'm just gonna measure out. And general rule of thumb, whenever you're working with masarina, if you're making tortillas, the general rule of thumb is equal parts liquid to equal parts masarina. So if you're making tortillas and this was 3 cups of masarina, you'd add 3 cups of hot water. Now, because we're making tamales, obviously it's gonna be more liquid content, so you're gonna need to add more than the 3 cups. So if you were just kind of like eyeballing or making up your own recipe, I have to add more than the amount that I have of masarina to make tamales. Now this is just 2 cups. It's not enough liquid, right? 2 cups of hot liquid with the 3 cups of masarina. But I just need that hot liquid to just start to like activate this masarina, because that's what's going to help rehydrate it, the heat of it. I'm going to add in our 1 cup of the vegetable broth and start to work that in. And that had enough of that vegetable broth flavoring, again, like I mentioned, to make about 3 cups. There are my mushrooms. Let me just turn that timer off. I will check those out right now. All right. And I could already see this is starting to come together pretty nicely, but still too dry for tamales. I'm going to spread this out and sprinkle in my 2 teaspoons of baking powder, not to be confused with baking soda. Baking powder is going in here. I'm gonna just gently mix that in or fold that in. And then I'm going to add in my 1 cup of coconut oil. Keyword, refined coconut oil. It might be like, whoa, that's a lot. This needs that. I mean, you can obviously make your tamales without all that coconut oil or oil in general. No, they'll be dry tamales, but they'll still be good. But people love the mouthfeel of how tamales come out also because they have that amount of fattiness. Our palate craves certain things, like craves a little bit of fat with certain dishes. So this will start working in. It's going to take me a little bit of time to get all that oil incorporated. I'm going to give my arm a break and check on the mushrooms and add some salt and keep working here. So let me check on how those mushrooms are doing. Let me grab. Ooh, these look great so far. I'm going to add a few more minutes because I like them to be a little bit more cooked down, but look at how nice those roasted mushrooms look. So good so far. I'm going to add maybe about 3 to 5 more minutes. You can see these look pretty great. Maybe just 3 more minutes and then I'll shut that off. So add a timer, 3 minutes. All right, let's check on our mole real quick before I lose track of that. And you want to just check on your mole that it doesn't stick to the bottom of the pot and start burning. This feels great. And if it did start sticking, just don't scrape it. Just try to pour out whatever you can into another pot. If you did burn the bottom, it's happened to all of us. As long as it didn't permeate the whole mixture, you can still try to salvage whatever you can. But we are good here. This can just kind of keep cooking. I have this on the lowest setting at this point. Just keep cooking low and slow. Keep marrying the flavors together. I'll leave the lid on, catch that little splatter. And let me come back to my tamales mixture, my masa harina, and keep working that in. You could also get a glove on and bring your hand in here and keep working on this. And this is going to be a really nice spreadable masa harina. All right. Let me add some salt. You want to be a little bit generous with your salt, a couple good pinches, but I'll say salt to taste here because it's really up to you. And you can taste a little bit of this and see if it needs more. Some people don't want to add a lot of salt to this because their filling might be kind of more on the salty side. And some people want to have this be really the star and the most flavorful point. So it's really up to you. Okay. So you can see that we have a nice kind of spreadable masa harina that's going to spread across our corn husk and give us a really nice tamal. If you wanted to, you could add, I mean, this consistency for me is fine. Some people like it even more loose and spreadable. Now we're getting into like family recipes and personal preferences. So it's really up to you. If some people want to be able to kind of just have something that feels like, kind of like a thick paint that they spread across the corn husk. My masas typically still has a little bit of bulkiness to it, a little bit more texture to it. So there are my mushrooms. Let me turn off that timer. I'm going to turn off the oven at this point and pull my mushrooms out. And I'm going to take a quick break to clean everything up, and I'll be back to assemble our tamales.
Hey everyone, sorry for the audio cutting out, but I'm rejoining with the voiceover. So here I am adding some salt to the masa. You can see that the masa is pretty smooth and that it still is holding together pretty well. I'm going to add a little bit of liquid to it. You can add broth or water just to loosen it up slightly, and this is going to help you spread the masa throughout the hojas a lot easier. I have my rehydrated hojas, which I like to squeeze all the liquid out of just to kind of pat them dry a little bit. For using an hoja, you definitely want to follow the natural direction of the hoja, so you can see kind of how it rounds around the elote or around the corn. So you want to work on that side of the hoja. I also really love using hojas that have don't have too many ripples or odd shapes on them. The smoother that the hoja is, the more smooth that the tamal will end up being, because it pretty much shapes to the form of the hoja itself. So here I just like to spread the masa all throughout the hoja until you get to sort of a square or rectangle shape using the wider side of the hoja. And I'm also adding some mole to it. This is about 2 ounces of masa and about 1 ounce of mole with a few of the mushrooms that we roasted off. And then we want to go ahead and roll this together. You start with bringing one side over. Sometimes I'm able to peel away the hoja and get it to stick to the tamal itself, so it's kind of rolling onto itself. I just try to avoid folding the hoja directly into the masa, just because you'll have that sort of disconnection that happens where the tamal isn't, the masa isn't kind of all together. It's separated by the hoja, so I try to keep the masa together as much as possible. Now I'm going to use my fingers, now that everything's rolled, to seal the bottom of the hoja, and I'm working or closing this on the same side that the tamal is closed on. So where the opening is, or the closing, whatever you would call it, you're pretty much just folding that bottom piece towards that opening or closing area of the corn husk to kind of seal it all together, so all the openings are all on one side. So here I'm bringing the masa, coating the hoja with masa on one side of the hoja, just to have the other one was more towards the center. Here you'll see it's more towards the side. Again, that was 2 ounces of masa with 1 ounce of our mole and a little bit of the mushrooms. And here you'll do the same thing, where you'll start with folding one side over. And like I said, sometimes I'm able to peel it away, sometimes I'm not. But more importantly, I'm trying to get the masa so that it's as sealed together as possible without the hoja separating the masa. And then here I have my opening, so I'm going to fold the bottom or the more narrow side of the hoja towards that opening. Now we have all of our tamales that have been assembled, and I'm going to be adding them to a pot. And here I just want to add them around the pot with the openings of the tamales towards the walls of the pot. You want to make sure that the openings where you can see the masa and the filling on the top are all facing up, so that as they steam, they don't fall into the liquid. And you want to just put them all around so that they're pretty much holding each other up. If you have any that are not quite fitting in, you can lay them on top, but I wouldn't put them towards the bottom. They'll definitely get a little bit smashed, and you'll have some of the masa coming out of it. So you want to really try to lay down any flat just on the top as needed. I'm going to add the lid, let these steam for at least an hour until they're fully cooked. And you can make sure to add any additional liquid as needed if you don't see any vapor escaping from the pot. All right, so our tamales have been cooking for a little bit over an hour, and I am going to open up the pot. It should be really hot and steamy. I added water one time about halfway through. I didn't really need it. I still saw the steam, but I added a little extra just in case. And here are our tamales. You can see that they've definitely plumped up slightly. You can see we've had some that have kind of burst off the seams a little bit. So they're going to be really, really soft, pliable. You can cook them for an hour and a half to be extra safe. Make sure they cook all the way through. I'm going to grab one just to demo how I would plate this up. Let me grab this one here. This one's actually really huge. Let me grab another one. Let's see. I'm having a hard time choosing which one do I want to eat. I'm gonna eat this one. All right, here we go. So I'm gonna add this to my plato, and I'll pan down right now. Put this back up. And I'll just leave that on low heat. So I have my tamal here, and I'm just going to actually flip this over, carefully open this up. And what I'm looking for is for the hoja to easily remove from the masa here. And I'm gonna open this just a little bit more. Ooh, it's so hot and steamy, and it smells so good. So I should have actually let this cool a little bit, because that's going to help it hold together a little bit more. But there is my tamal. So good. I just had a little piece of masa right now. And I like to just add a little bit of mole over the top. That'll help to just garnish it and add a little bit more of that mole flavor to it. Obviously, this is optional. The mole, I added about 3/4 cups liquid to it just to loosen it up a little bit thick. So you can obviously add a little bit more liquid to it. You can check for salt. I'm just going to pour a little bit of this mole over the tamal. I'm going to add a little bit of pickled red onion that I have on hand already. I really love pairing pickled onions with mole. It just gives it a little nice punch of acidity that I think helps pair really nicely with that sort of depth of flavor that mole brings. It gives it a nice little pop or brightness. And then I'm going to add just a little bit of sesame seeds for garnish. Just something I like to use to garnish mole specifically. You can add black sesame seeds, you can add brown sesame seeds, you can add both. I'm going to end up adding both because I have both. Why not? And there we have it. There is our tamal de mole. And I'm going to take a bite. Ooh, so good. Let me grab a little bit of this masa, a mushroom, a little bit of onion. There we go. Yum. This is so good. Your friends, family are going to think you spent hours upon hours, which you are going to a certain extent. But the mole is really what takes it over the top, because tamales are already such a labor-intensive dish, and then you add mole into the mix, it just layers on so much complexity, so much work. Folks are going to be so grateful to you for making this dish. So hopefully you enjoy. If you have any questions, comments, please let us know. You can always enter comments into the chat below or into the comments below. And you can always email us with any questions. But thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoy these tamales.